Perhaps we'll just get started. I'm Anahat Dylan. I am Associate Professor of Critical Care and Anesthesia at CAC USC, and I also work at the VA with Dr. Wang and Dr. Schwarzenberger. And I think this session came out of our conversations over the last several years around burnout, seeing many of our colleagues burn out, personally burning out, each of us at various points in our career, and really want to get people together here. Hopefully it's a small enough group where we can talk about it in a different fashion than what we traditionally have heard. We're going to start with Cynthia giving us a history of burnout, and then Dr. Schwarzenberger, Johanna will take over from there, and then have an open dialogue with as many of our guests here as we can.
Thanks, Anahat. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cynthia, and I am currently acting chief of the anesthesiology group at the Los Angeles VA. And as Dr. Dillon mentioned, this conversation, the impetus for this conversation was really born of some of the many observations and conversations that we've had as team members at the VA. And, I'd really like to keep this a true campfire session, meaning I really would like this to be a conversation amongst peers. So unlike some of the lectures that you guys have attended previously with regards to burnout, I really don't want to have this be in mostly lecture format. I'd really like to engage all of you as participants in a mutual conversation. So if you're anything like me, you've listened to a million lectures about burnout. I mean, it's certainly been a hot topic in medicine over the last year, 2 years in the context of the pandemic, and the number of articles that have been written about burnout has really exploded in the medical literature, at least in the last couple of years. But I don't know about you guys, but every time I read one of these things or listen to one of these lectures, there's always still something missing about really hitting the nail on the head in terms of why we're feeling like this, how we got to this point. And, if we don't even really understand the origins of how we ended up here, how we're going to even approach solving this issue. And so, part of my focus was that I really don't want us to be talking in circles again and again. And I really want this to be an examination of how we ended up here in the first place. So I started actually looking at some of the articles about burnout, just kind of in the general press, because I feel like when it's ended up in the general press, it's no longer a local issue. It's a general societal concern. And it was interesting because what became apparent was that we've been talking about this for a much, much longer time than I think we are all aware. And many of the conversations have been very similar. So I just want to give you a few examples of some of the things that I found. And, you'll be surprised, I think, to hear when some of these things were written and when some of these thoughts were circulated. So I'd like to start with a Time magazine article about burnout. It talks about burnout in a variety of professions, including healthcare, teachers, social workers, and this is all kind of stuff that we've been listening to over the last couple of years. The author talks about how, describes burnout as a ticket out, as an excuse, something that allows people to enact serial selves, just like divorce permits serial marriages. That article was from 1981. Again, a New York Times article that talks about a wave of burnout amongst corporate employees. And it talks about all these potential solutions, things like limiting the work week to 40 hours, discouraging employees from checking emails on weekends, coming up with buddy systems for staff so that people have mentorship within the company, reducing mandatory overtime. And if you're like me, all of this kind of stuff sounds pretty familiar because it's very similar to some of the conversations and some of the ideas that have been thrown out in recent years. And surprisingly, that article was actually from 1999. More recently, there was a BBC article about burnout amongst Scandinavian workers. And if you're like me, I was surprised to read about this because, I think we all know and at least have the perception that Swedes are some of the most progressive people in the world in terms of work culture. Less than 1% of Swedes work more than 50 hours a week. And there's a very strong culture of flexibility and parental leave and childcare. But the number of chronic stress-related illnesses amongst young people has increased by 144% since 2013. And so, you know, this was interesting because some of the ideas that came out of this in terms of why this was happening was that, you know, we live in a modern society that basically encourages to live out our dreams, but just the mere fact of that can actually create disappointment when things don't go to plan. And that article was from 2019. And so, as you can see, we've been having these conversations for a really, really long time now. And in the physician community, I think, you know, this may not have started as early as the 70s in some other industries where, you know, we saw that turning point when non-supervisory employee wages really started going down. But you know, it's been going on for many decades. And so this is definitely not a new issue. And I think we really need to start thinking about pivoting the conversation away from the individual in terms of, you know, what are you not doing? Are you not meditating? Are you not going to yoga class? But really thinking about systemically, how can we socially engineer the systems that we work in and the microenvironments that we work in to attenuate this issue? Ultimately, I think we have to begin recognizing that we're working in one-way honor systems where we as anesthesiologists, as physicians, are ever devoted to our craft, but we work in a setting in which often the institution in which we exist does not reciprocate that sentiment. And I think it's important to verbalize that and recognize that and go from there. And so with that, I'll leave those thoughts with you and I'll pass it on to Dr. Schwarzenberger to continue the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, so with what Dr. Wang initiated in terms of giving us a framework of how old the phenomenon of burnout is, I'd like to talk a little bit of how it is for me when I have listened to a grand rounds about burnout and then have to work with the resident the same day. And basically, I come from a point where I have always thought my entire career as an attending that whatever ails me in the operating room ails my resident, and whatever ails my resident must be ailing me, even if I, you know, can choose to go to the bathroom whenever I want or eat whenever I want. So I think, but I've always lived on this premise, and I've had a big interest in understanding of why the chronic exhaustion is built into residency. And so with that, I learned about Dr. Ludmerer, who is actually a medical historian, specifically having written the entire history of medical education in the United States. So from the Flexner Report onward, or even before, to his last book, which is called Let Me Heal. And in this book, he actually describes that the recent changes in terms of work hour restrictions for residents, so we have them now since like the early 2002 or so, that the idea was fine, having, you know, said you don't want to make people make any mistakes because they're exhausted, also known as the Levy-Zine Act, passed through Congress. But what really has happened is that the residence programs have responded with the new regulations with really ingenious and often Byzantine schedules designed to eliminate the reason why residents overarch their work hours, but the actual workload has not changed. In fact, one could argue that workload in terms of administrative duties or checking the computers and documenting has, if of anything, has increased and has moved further away of a resident actually engaging with a patient, sitting next to a patient, examining a patient, but rather doing a lot of paperwork. So it's a shell game. The work hour regulations are a shell game, and I would like to put this out as a way of saying, probably our ways as attendings of saying how much we can work is also a shell game, because we don't have any metrics to continuously assess our workload, not just in time, but also in density and emotional challenges that we are under. So back to what ails me must ail my resident, I have always realized that how do I find a proper forum to actually talk with the resident about, or my medical students or my fellows about what is happening to them, what their aspirations are. And the first challenge to that is privacy in our current work environments. So the three of us here are running the session. We still actually have a physical office. I would argue that this is already something that most anesthesiologists don't have. They live out of a knapsack when they come to work. And definitely the residents are yearning for workstations in which they can congregate by themselves, but there's really very little room for a private location. Like when I was a resident, that I could go to my attending in their office and speak to them. And so what happens is, without the proper forum to discuss what might be happening, or what is the systemic form right now, or what we have learned in the lecture, how does it pertain to our healthcare system? There seems to be also another aspect at play, and that is sort of a rite of passage. If you're not been burnt out, you really haven't worked hard enough in anesthesia, or you're not tending to do the sick cases and so forth. And so with that, I think a lot of our feelings are actually being pushed away. So we may be angry about a surgeon addressing us wrongly, or we may have fear of a case, or we may have grief that the residency program or the hospital that we chose to do our work in is no longer providing the area of work that we want to do. But we are constantly asked to actually dispel or like bypass these feelings. So for example, if you have any anger about something, the health system will easily suppress that with asking you to fill out an incident report, okay? And escaping, we all do that. We'll go to the gift shop and buy some chocolate, or we engage on social media just to be in a different bubble for this moment, to not feel it. Or we may talk to someone about it and they're just say, okay, I'm going to act on it, and they're just going to send it to someone else to have with their problems. So in a lot of our relations, we are not engaged, we are not allowing ourselves to have these feelings, and we don't have any room to do so. And so what I try to do with residents who have encountered a problem, and that doesn't have to be a completely adverse event. Sometimes it's just something they were treated by even, an attending who usually means well. I will ask them how they feel without judging or controlling this feeling. Like, why does it make you feel bad for yourself? And then also to a more important point, if this is a repetitive feeling, stop the story. Like, don't talk about the story, but tell me, what would you like to do? Why would you like to go in another direction, and how you're going to achieve that? And then furthermore, reveal and don't conceal. So for me, that means that I will share with the residents my own ambivalence sometimes about the path that I personally have taken in my career in anesthesiology. And that sometimes can be very hard. So I think that for me, the most important thing is in reading the burnout literature and listening to all the people that have done already great strides in their programs, is that I feel we should not be in the immediate, because we're so upset about this happening and people are leaving the healthcare system. I think we ought to be stepping back a little bit more and say, how do anesthesiologists are unique in this phenomenon? What is very different from us to other practitioners? Probably we share the perioperative sphere, but I would argue we also have, as anesthesiologists, a very specific way of handling stress, very, very differently than surgeons or nurses who are working with us in the operating room or elsewhere. And so I would invite to think about what studies could we actually do to quantify the stress other than in questionnaires. But really, we usually manage stress for other patients all the time through the perioperative period. We know a lot about stress. We ought to be able to study ourselves what the stress does to us. I know of many residents having hemoglobin A1Cs that are high, and them not trying to repeat it because they need to sign up for life insurance when they become attendings. People get back pain, people get tinnitus from the alarms. So I think there's physiological data still to be had to actually bring this to a more OSHA type problem. We are doing something to ourselves that is beyond work hours, that we ought to be quantifying. And then I think on a very different way is we also should invite back the humanity and what made us to become a doctor in the first place into this conversation. So a lot of it is that the people who are quitting their job right now past the pandemic who are not in medicine, they have realized that their jobs have no meaning for them. They're much better off at home making their sourdough and finding other income streams to be happy. But in medicine, that's not so easy to drop that. We have been on this journey for a very long time. And we identify ourselves with getting up in the morning to help somebody or to help the world as a greater view. So in summary, I think for me, really, I had to realize that I had to work in a system that is not financially endowing me anymore for the work I do. So for me, I ended up in the VA because there I could practice the humanity in medicine. But the problem has not gone away. Our nurses are also quitting, and a lot of our physicians are disgruntled who we work with. So apart from questioning the medical industrial complex, I really think this session, I would invite us all to brainstorm of what it is that we would like to see to change dramatically from not one chairman speaking to administrators saying we need more comfortable chairs or lounge or refrigerator in the OR area, or we are all doing civility training with each other. All these things are kind of working, but I think for us, more importantly, we should really find out that the work is hard and that the work is different at different stages of our lives. And with that definition, to allow ourselves to really take back our stance of being a physician to others and to ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna. And Cynthia, I think what I hear from both of you and what I feel also, and we've spoken about, is it's about identity and true north, right? Or we call transverse orientation in this particular scenario. Belonging and heading in the direction that got us on this path in the first place, rather than thinking about doing yoga or having our outside life from our careers be a balance to the work that we're doing. Because unlike a lot of other professions or industries where there's discussion around burnout and where a lot of the burnout literature comes from, we have committed so much to being here, and what we're dealing with are human lives, not machines and offices. And so trying to balance it by having a work-life balance doesn't seem to work, at least what we've seen in the literature and what we've seen over and over again amongst our colleagues. People will start taking time off, but then come back and nothing's fundamentally changed. I wonder how you guide people, trainees, colleagues, and for yourselves to find your belonging or your tribe and to refocus on your mission at all times. How do we put that into a systematic approach, and how do we build our hospitals and departments to include that?
So, I think that's a really good question. And I think actually, in many regards, we've been overthinking it and trying to, I really don't think it's something that can be achieved by inviting a speaker and doing a training. And I think it comes from something really fundamentally basic. And this is going to sound so simple, but it comes from just the pure idea of transformational leadership by the philosophy that you come to work every day as a leader and you lift other people up. And it doesn't mean that you have to be a chairperson or director of anything. It just means that, when you get to the next level, you reach back to a trainee or a junior staff member and and you give them a leg up. You give them an opportunity to also achieve something within the system, or achieve what they would like to achieve within the system. And you know, it sounds like something so not worth mentioning, but I really do think that that probably is a huge component of what is actually truly missing in a lot of systems right now.
Should we ask some of the people who are sitting around the imaginary fire? Anyone wants to say anything? Let's see. I don't even know how many people are there anyway. I don't see them.
I guess let's pose a question of how do you feel like where do you belong when you come to work?
I belong the most foremost to my patients when I'm there, and I have the luck to take great pride in it, but also to get a lot of energy back from the patients in all aspects of anesthesia I've done. Jane is asking a question. Transverse orientation. You want to refer to her? Jane is asking, could you define transverse orientation for us?
I think the simplest way, I mean, that you can define it, and it's taken from the concept of a moth following the light, and initially evolutionarily meant to follow the moonlight. But as cities grew, more artificial light came out, and now we see moths flying into light bulbs all the time and burning themselves out. And for us, I think, I mean, when we were talking about this in our offices, that feels very much like what's happening in medicine. We started medicine because we felt the need to help our patients and belong to our patients and really put ourselves into that work. As we have gone along in our careers, there have been academic pressures, financial pressures, administrative pressures, paperwork, legal pressures that keep distracting us from the person that's lying in front of us. I mean, as an ICU doctor, the last 2 years has really been about refocusing and looking at the patient and the patient's family and seeing, well, this is why I really came to work. The pandemic definitely either made people burn out more in the critical care field, or I think we focused a lot of clinicians into understanding why we do critical care. Why is it that we are here in an unknown space, not knowing what to do, and often losing many, many patients? But we come to work every day because it's those patients that you can help. And for me, also the patients that you can help transition to the end of their life in as meaningful of a way during the most difficult way to die that I've seen in my career. Those are the moments I hold on to and redirect. Jane, hopefully that answers your question.
I'll add a little bit to that, actually. So a great book, I think, that if you guys are interested in looking into, is a book called The End of Burnout by Jonathan Malasich. And in that book, he actually points out that often the professions with the highest ideals and sort of pureness of purpose are those who are most likely to burn out. And it's 1000%, I think, related to what Anahat was just saying, where you go to work with this ideal of what you want to accomplish every day for the patient, but then somehow a million things get in the way. And so how are we going to help each other overcome those barriers or get rid of those barriers and make it easier for each other to achieve what we want to achieve? I think during the pandemic, this was most acutely felt because if any of you guys had some of the experiences that I think we had, we went to work thinking, okay, we're dealing with at the very beginning an unknown disease, and we want to take the best care of patients as possible. But there was so much administrative noise and confusion, and often I think for many people, it felt like your own administrators were actually making it more difficult or getting in your way. And so I think, working to create environments where those barriers are fewer, I think is important.
So there's something in the chat, right? On that?
I was just going to say, I think Summer put something in the chat that speaks very closely to what Cynthia you're saying, is that there's all this talk of we're here for our patients, but really there's a push for getting the cases done. And I know as part of your role, it's also to be an OR director at the VA and help get the cases done. How do you balance that? And the VA is one of the kinder systems as far as some of these pressures that Summer's alluding to. How do you balance that for yourself and for your teams?
I think, I'm, again, like you mentioned, I'm very lucky to work in a system that is not, in a system in which sort of the financial incentives are a much more distant consideration. And I think what I see in a lot of the staff members that end up wanting to join our department is that they join because they're a little bit closer to that sense of purity of what do I want to do for the patient and how can I do that? And so generally speaking, we probably have a lot less of that and in the VA system than we do in perhaps other systems. Ultimately, I think also the other thing is that, we work in a system, at least in our group, where everybody's pretty much on an equal playing field. There's not a lot of sort of vying for extra, accolades or this, that, or the other. I mean, it really is just purely about patient care. And so again, I'm very lucky in that we don't really inherently work in an environment where some of these other sort of misdirected incentives get in the way of patient care.
I want to answer to Summer as well. I really think that the imbalance of what is being described as negative energy comes from the health systems allowing to use the surgeon as being the most important person to direct the care, to bring in, this concept of they bring in the patients, and the turnover is important for our bottom line. And I think that if we were as anesthesiologists to show that this kind of pressure of pushing the stretcher ourselves down the hallway because no one else will do it faster and efficiently than us, will cause cancer, and we're going to sue the health system for it, they would treat us differently. And I think it's time to really go back and be in position to ourselves of saying, we will study this. We are not just going to be ingenious, just like with the work hours in the residence and just making the schedules better and distributing the workload. It is really time now, with this reckoning that so many people are leaving the workforce, and we cannot allow another anesthesiologist to leave. Particularly in my former area of pediatric anesthesia, is a horrendous gap of people who are willing to do this high stress environment. I really think that it will be very, very important to defend our health and study it and be in solidarity against this on a much higher level than we are before have done it. And I think with the passage of the Lower Brain Act, and money being available, it behooves the anesthesiologist to apply for some grants and actually study our stress in a constructive way to change it for us.
I would love to hear from everyone else as to what techniques they are using and what are in their systems holding you back. I know Summer, you speak to, I think, what a lot of us feel, which is getting pushed to external pressures to perform. But what are some other pressures that people feel? I think that definitely is an elephant in the room. Ellen's talking about the profit systems in healthcare, and this conflict between business and patient care. And like we've all alluded to, the VA system is a model for where that doesn't pressure us quite as much, and allows for some security that probably mitigates burnout, or why a lot of physicians burn out and come to the VA system as a shelter, it seems like.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's interesting because, you know, when you think about kind of the trends and what happened in industrial farming, it's sort of similar to what's happening in medicine. And, you know, you think about sort of this trend of farmers getting stuck in these toxic relationships with large, you know, companies that make certain types of grain or fertilizer or equipment, and being indebted to them. And then, you know, over time, their land becomes more and more depleted. And sort of the art of farming is stripped away. It's very, very similar to what's happening to us in what, or I should say, what has happened to us in medicine, in that the profit model, you know, is really inherently at odds with what we learn in school, what our purest intentions were in terms of going into medicine. And then when you think about it on a greater level, you know, the profit model is also at odds with our work in terms of advocating public health. And so that's you know, I think that's a really difficult, much more difficult question to tackle. And it probably is ultimately what is wrong in the system, because we've kind of gotten to a point now in our society where you know, the legislation, the sort of fiscal control of healthcare systems is largely being legislated by big money, by lobbyists, by people with much more money and power. And it's going to take a lot more solidarity, I think, amongst physicians, amongst anesthesiologists, you know, to change the tides of that. But it certainly isn't impossible. And I think if there was a little bit more unity and sort of coordination amongst everybody, we might be able to make changes in that. And I think starting with what Dr. Schwarzenberger was talking about, really kind of systematically, scientifically documenting the damages of the traumatic work that we do, of the hours that people are working, of the conditions under which people are working, that could be the start to making some of those changes.
If you use the farmer analogy, what happened in India 6-7 months ago with the protests against large industrial farming, and the ultimate success of that due to protests and protests on the street, really led to what was an unbelievable change, and a shift in policy. So maybe what you're saying is we need to do that, maybe not at that scale, but somewhere in that order, to continue to beat the drum that we are not here to toe that line. I think, Summer, you speak a little bit about academic pressures, and I often reflect on academic pressures, and as a division chief, speak to my junior faculty. What is it that truly it means to be in academics? Is it publishing papers for the sake of publishing papers? Is it getting a title because you want the title, and that's what you're supposed to do? Is it education because that's what you're supposed to do? Or can we shift what academics really means to allow people to do patient care and what they love to do? And I think that's what you're mentioning there is incredibly important. Maybe the definition of what it means to be an academic physician needs to change completely.
I'm going to answer Jane's question. I think, Jane, departments need to understand that they are the ones that need to do the organizing for the solidarity that we talk about. Departments are not there to lower people so that, you know, they can sit at the table and say, I'm representing this department. So I think it's, we have these people in upper management to represent us, to actually represent anesthesiologists across the board, not to just manage the stall so that the hospital administration is not coming after the chairman or the vice chair of quality or whatever the positions are. And in that, if we don't have anyone to look up to, and if we ourselves, when we come to work, think, you know, we're discussing call schedules as if it's like a loaf of bread that we would like to eat or otherwise don't have, we are not going to make headway in actually creating an environment in which we heal patients again. Because if it's just financial, we will never go back into the positive balance of why we went to medicine. Because burnout ultimately is the difference between what you thought you were going to do and what you're doing. That is what's burning the candle in our souls. And the same is true for academic medicine. If the goalpost is constantly moving of what it means to go higher, or if we don't even know what the promotion is actually entailing in terms of benefits for your own next step of development, then all this becomes meaningless. So I think it's really, anesthesiology has a big advantage in that we interact with all other specialties, like the radiology, emergency medicine, you know, in peds, all the medical specialties up to dermatology, neurology. We interact with all of them. We see the impact of academic medicine and a lot of our colleagues, and I think we have a good understanding that they have specific challenges to their specialty, but also very unified problems in terms of that our self-esteem and how we think as a physician has been completely decimated by the work environment that we work in. And I think we should, as departments, bound together to change that for physicians, because it is very real. We have elders now that taste from the medicine that we are suffering under, and they're having bad experiences, and we have bad experience being on the other side. So it's now the time to change that, so that when we get ill, we have help. I really think that it's a very big task. It's not just how much more money we're getting or how many women are going to be professors. These are all very important things as well. But I think the most important thing is the humanitarian crisis that we're actually witnessing in our own work environment, and to change that.
I think, go ahead, Cynthia.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think one question that departments have to ask themselves is, are you there to serve the members of your department, or are you there to placate the administrators? And that's a very important question to have an honest answer to. Ultimately, you know, when you think about the reasons you went into medicine and how you trained to become an anesthesiologist, and you think about the process of becoming an anesthesiologist, going to the oral boards and, you know, sitting in front of colleagues and justifying the reasons that you would manage something in a certain way. I mean, all of this requires creative thinking. All of this taps into sort of that art of really being a physician. And do you go to work every day, and do you work in a department that supports that and celebrates that? Or do they try to make you stick to a protocol and do the case regardless of what other concerns you have about the patient? I mean, I think that's really the thing that is the responsibility of departments, to advocate for the people who are working in those departments.
I think Ellen brings a good point. Where do we go? Who do we talk to? And there's, at least I think there's got to be a local culture, right? And a local pressure within the institution, within the department, which is hard for the department to do. But if the department holds together and says, you know, I don't believe in this Toyota Six Sigma lean model of medicine, which really is what I hear 99% of the hospital systems I've ever been a part of is anathema to my ability to take care of critically ill patients. Cannot do it in a lean methodology when you're talking about the patients we sometimes take care of. And then, the other end of it, of course, is there needs to be legislative change that allows healthcare systems to step away from these financial models that we're mired in. So I think there's got to be a very high level and a very ground level approach to this. And I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a little vague.
I want to say something to an organization that I think is failing us in that regard, and that's the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation. I think that the history of the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation had a lot of strength in claiming, in knowing that, we as anesthesiologists are inviting other specialties and other sciences into the science of making our anesthetics safe. And I think we got to reinvigorate that for ourselves in our own work conditions. And they are starting to do something about burnout, but I think we should remind them of what we actually want from them, that they help us, because any other institution, any other society has immediately, unfortunately, the medical industrial complex against them. And I think the safety and saying we're doing safety differently than the rest of the hospital with their Six Sigma models it would be an important start. And other people would say to unionize. I'm not so sure if this would actually represent what we want as physicians.
In a more concrete way, how do we support our trainees? I mean, I think both of you in your conversations talked about junior faculty or trainees. And Jana, you talked a lot about education. How do we, on a day-to-day, support our trainees to be able to enter this system if we cannot change the system? How do we support them so that they can enter it and be successful without meeting some of the, I think, issues we all have met in our careers or seen our colleagues go through?
I think one thing that's really important is to remind folks, because medical training and becoming an anesthesiologist, that whole process is so all-consuming. And I think we can all agree that the people that we became during medical school and residency, and then the years subsequent to that, are probably somewhat different, if not very different, from the people we were before we entered medicine. And I think it's really important for people, when they have a chance to finally take a breath and take a little bit of time, to remember who they were before they entered medicine, and to bring that identity to their work on a day-to-day basis and to their interactions on a day-to-day basis. And I think, it's really important not to get lost in this is, I guess, rat race of trying to climb whatever ladder you're trying to climb within your career, and really think about what it is you're trying to achieve, what it is that it's going to bring to yourself as an individual, as a professional, that's going to bring you fulfillment, and not lose sight of that.
I think one mantra that I've always followed in encouraging residents to find that path is to basically say they're worthy of being a physician regardless of what they do. Like, if they do it with an intensity, that's all that's needed. If they do 1 day a week and otherwise are in the lab, or they do liver transplants, or they're critical care physicians, there's no hierarchy. It has to be intense and interesting to them, and it has to sustain them. And I think that's an important part when you are with them, that you never impose your own life and your own path in judging them. I think being non-judgmental on their life path and their life vision is an important aspect of the support for them. And so, February, March is always my favorite time in a training program because people suddenly, I get a little glimpse of who they were before they started studying for the MCATs. You know, people start looking at what car they want to buy, or they start getting their nails done again. They're, you know, everyone has a little edge. They're listening to music loud in the car. I don't know. I think this is the part we have too little now of in terms of sharing. I think, you know, when I trained, there was still much more cohabitation of these private spaces with each other just by having a physical room. And I think because it has been taken away from us for most of the part, we don't even encourage this in each other so much of who we are outside of medicine or who we want to be outside of medicine.
So I guess, I mean, what we're talking then ties back into diversity and equity in many, many ways. It seems to me like we need to have diverse options and systems for people to be able to work within, which comes back to call schedules and shifts and hours. And how do we build a department or a hospital system that allows for that and that allows people to choose their path?
Again, I would say we know that it's very bad to work at night, for example. We know that. We also know it's very bad for the patients to be woken up at night and have the blood pressure taken. And we know so much about it. It's amazing that we continue to hire surgeons without having time on a block schedule for them, right? And most of our unhappiness, you know, at 5 o'clock in front of a board comes from these external decisions. And the way to change it really is to show the effect on the human body of this type of work, and to really only allow in absolute extraneous circumstances that work is done after 8 p.m., for example. And it would change dramatically of how we feel about our work if the work that we do in its intensity and stress is actually assessed correctly. I just think that has never happened. We're always finding quicker answers to go around it. And I think for our trainees, predictability in schedule would make a huge thing already of having the balance built in without fighting for it, for example, or knowing that people over 50 probably shouldn't take call anymore because their dexterity at night goes way down. You know, just like pilots, they don't fly commercial planes anymore. If this is a priori, no one has to apologize for it, you know? At least that's my vision, let's say it this way.
The challenge, of course, we face is that to achieve that, the numbers we need are a lot higher, right, of actual anesthesiologists or intensivists. And yet the system does not support more people entering into the field. I can say that as I look at our ICU schedules, and every time we have more people join, we have more people leave than join, because it's an endless cycle. So it feels sometimes like the whole thing has to be broken and restart. Is there any path that doesn't require that?
I think we really have to just chip away at it in small pieces. I mean, I think that brings up a whole separate issue of scarcity in healthcare in this country. And that's something that's been sort of long manufactured through legislation and sort of the political history of medicine, and how that resulted in, a very limited number of training spots, very high bar for people coming from other countries, foreign medical grads, to come here and practice, train and practice. But, I do think that to begin with, we probably need to, just like Dr. Schwarzenberg was talking about, we really need to show the real physiological effects, the real safety impacts of, what we're doing. and the negative impacts that it's having potentially on not only ourselves, but possibly even on patients.
I think another way to do it is actually also to make the resources that we are dealing with a more communal process. You know, I feel like if you leave it to an intern to schedule an IR case for an ICU patient that has a host of problems that could be washed with one anesthesiologist with 3 other stops, we probably would be better off. But we don't give ourselves this room anymore. We are constantly managing at the edge of chaos, you know, instead of coming up with innovative ideas of deciding what really needs to get done today and how we're going to do it with the resources we are having. We always, you know, that's what I feel in terms of teaching the residents, of not immediately asking for and acting on, but figuring out what are really right now in that institution the most annoying things that take enormous amount of energy and manpower, and how can we change that? And in an open discussion, independent of how the insurance is going to pay for it. And I think there are many ways of redundant work that we could actually take out without Six Sigma, just by being a good doctor, basically. So.
Feels sometimes like anesthesiology and probably radiology and some of these hospital-based specialties are particularly at risk for this, because we intersect with so many aspects within the system, that trying to belong to anything is very challenging, right? You belong to yourselves, but you don't really belong to anything within the healthcare system. So trying to get buy-in and moving the needle can be very frustrating, because you're balancing GI with IR with the cardiac surgeons in the OR. How do we push the administrators to understand the sort of particular challenges of hospital-based specialties that run more cross system, say, a straightforward vertical system of cardiology or cardiac surgery or GI?
I mean, ultimately, as a general sort of subjective opinion, I think there needs to be more infiltration of the administrative ranks by clinicians, by clinical anesthesiologists who kind of understand that. I mean, I think part of what I see as the issue is that, you know, so much of the administrative staff has been populated by people who really either are not clinically involved at all, have no clinical background, or folks who left the clinical sphere many, many moons ago. And I think if you're not really, you know, if you're not in the trenches every once in a while with folks, it's really difficult for people to kind of grasp what it means for a specialty that's working not only with operating room subspecialties, but also a variety of procedural subspecialties.
I think we have about 4 minutes left. I want to see if anyone else in the audience had any other thoughts or comments around, you know, how do we go from just measuring high rates of burnout to actually starting to chip away at the needle for ourselves and our colleagues, whether locally or systematically. If nothing, I mean, I guess I will sort of take some closing remarks from each of us. I have seen and been exposed to burnout a lot in my particular subspecialty, and probably been burnt out myself. All I can say is, at the end of the day, coming is knowing that my patients are here for me and I am here for them, and refocusing on that, at least in the moment, mitigates more burnout than any other techniques that I have done. Same thing when I think about my team and refocusing on my team and the individuals within it, and appreciating that helps. What further change we can make within our institutions, I think is to be seen. Pushing for that always is my mission, at least here at CAC.
I think what you're describing there, Anahat, is the very tip of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which, you know, you're a purpose-driven person. And I think, you know, when people go to work and sort of that sense of purpose is blurred because of all the other distractions that we have. I mean, this goes back to the idea of transverse orientation with moths. That is when I think the environment is ripe for burnout.
Any last words, Johanna?
Yeah, I really just think like I'm an anesthesiologist like with blood and flesh for so long, and I feel that I'm always not 100% sure that I'm the person they're describing with burnout. So when I read it, I was like, it's not me. Although I've had burnout at least 10 times in my career, of various levels, of like feeling like I cannot get out of bed today, and I always schlepped myself to work and did the work. That wasn't the problem. I feel it's we are on a societal point of where if we don't do anything for our youth to say this is worthwhile, this is all good to do, we're not going to have people in medicine at all, and we're going to be, our cancer and our, you know, heart attack is going to be managed only by physician extenders, and we're going to get mad at ourselves. And I think that is a call that we have to really understand and make and find spaces, or allow ourselves to find spaces to really make the difference of what a physician actually is. And it's not that I now have to also study psychology and anthropology to describe burnout better. No, it is to create continuously the space to be a physician for others.
Well, thank you both for the conversation, and thank you to everyone that came. I hope it triggered something. We're all easily accessible and happy to chat around the campfire anytime.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.